Hello again, this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru. Had a glitch just a moment ago, and we're going to try to give it another shot today. This is Just in Time Productions Game Mastery Series, and today we're going to be covering the subject of challenge ratings, how to build a compelling encounter monster by monster. One of the greatest challenges in Dungeons and Dragons in particular, and in role-play games in general, is, I'm trying to figure which way to go here. All right, is to try to figure out a way to maintain story consistency, match your monsters to your settings, set up the actual encounter itself, figure out whether the creatures are encountering the monster or whether the monster is encountering them, assess the player's readiness, response, and reaction to the encounter, reacting to the player's core competencies and possibly random reactions, and to determine the challenge rating on the fly, because quite often the actual challenge rating of the creature may need to be adapted in the session in order to not end up in either a TPK or a unsatisfactory overkill situation. Close my little windows here. I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you about this today, and we're going to start right at the beginning, dealing with creating an encounter. We really have to look at it from the standpoint of the reasons for the encounter, and I'm not going to go into all the details of that. We've spoken about that a little bit in the past, but in particular, we're going to be looking today at the issues you need to take into account when you're going to put a certain encounter or monster before your players. The first thing is to look at the story consistency. Is the existence of this creature something that is ostensibly expected, or something that can be adjusted to by the players? We also have to look at the conditions of the location to make sure they're coherent and associated appropriately with the kind of result we're trying to accomplish. For example, if the intent is for the party to meet, say, a dragon, certainly a creature of this size and magnitude isn't a secret in its environment. It will apparently have left a footprint of sorts. You know, it'll leave scorch marks if it's a standard red dragon. It will be leaving corpses of its uncompleted meals and things like this laying about. And so, can the players expect to be aware of this creature or this engagement before it ever occurs? Certainly, if we're talking something of this magnitude, it's not going to be a situation where they'll be totally surprised. And if for some reason this happens to be the case, you seriously have to reconsider the course of your storytelling if they're not aware of the dragon next door, so to speak. We also want to make sure that the creature encounter is going to be able to maintain the story's chronological continuity. In other words, are we going to be looking at a situation where the players are going to mess up their long-term plans if they encounter this monster at this point? They need to be not only aware of what it might mean if they succeed, but more importantly, what it might mean if they fail and just rile up the creature. They might be looking at environmental concerns for a long time to come if they rile up a dragon who now goes on a terror and damages or destroys their local community. It's really something that needs to be taken into account. Another thing that has to be taken into account in the creating of the environment is the biosphere. What, for example, has the creature been surviving on, or what was its food source before the beginning of the story, and are the players' interactions going to interfere with that, or more to the point, are they going to, again, have to take into account what they might be doing to the overall storyline? Furthermore, if the creatures that the players are about to encounter are a natural cap to the checks and balances in the local biosphere, by the party taking out this monster or driving it off, are they going to affect lesser beings in the area and cause even more trouble than they originally intended to? Also, in setting up your encounter, you need to look at it from the standpoint of integration of villainy. And by that I mean, if you have an ongoing story arc where there is a bad guy or bad guys or cadre of villains, does this specific encounter fall into something that's going to link to those storylines, or is this a standalone singular event? And if so, how is it important to the story, and does it actually further their agenda to encounter the creature as you expect? I know this is a lot of information to try to boil down, but this is the stuff that a game master does between sessions as he's working towards the next week's encounters. He's putting together the possibilities of what they might meet, and in doing so, you have to also look at the implications of alternatives. Let's say you've created a week that you plan for them to fight the red dragon, but they take one look at the storyline and say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go do something else. What are the implications of the decisions they make? And if they do walk away from it, what will be your alternatives as a storyteller? You have to kind of at least keep an eye on this possibility, because you never know week over week whether the storyline itself is going to be compelling. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but realize that it does mean that you might even have to prepare for a storyline course correction in short order if the players feel very strongly about not engaging the very monsters that you've created for that week. Now, when we look at the very concept, pardon me a second. When we look at the concept of creating an encounter, we definitely have to match the monsters to the settings. For example, if we are, say, running a Raven's Loft / horror type storyline, it may not be very appropriate for us to run into a standard fairy dragon or band of pixies or such like that. They may, I mean, you can certainly cause it to be a match if you adjust the story or alter the conditions, but when you're matching the monster to the setting rather than the other way around, you want to make sure that you're taking into account thematic consistencies. In other words, if I was running around in a Raven's Loft type setting or Call of Cthulhu Gothic horror kind of environment, I would more likely meet some kind of a creature that is either an attendant of the undead, or something that serves either as a food source or conversely a predator upon the primary big baddie. And when you think of it in that terms, you can then start to build a story arc within the adventure, within the very encounter, that will feed into your story development. This leads, of course, the second part is how effective will this encounter be in reaching these objectives? Are we going to be facing challenges and rewriting our adventure in the future, or is it going to be a situation where what they engage with, the monster that we place before them, fits perfectly into the current story arc? Now, even with the possibility that the monster is a perfect match, we do have to consider story credibility and continuity, because if the hero of the story so far has been, say, of the centaur race, placing the party in a place where they have to fight a group of centaurs may be antithetical to the story, and even though it might be a perfect match in terms of monster motivation and things like that, it may actually hinder the advancement of your plot line. What this means in effect, therefore, is that we want to gauge the player's feedback even before we meet this monster. In other words, in storytelling in earlier weeks and in previous encounters, you'll have an idea of what they are looking forward to fighting or they expect to meet, and then you can gauge your encounter or measure your encounter in terms of success failure along that boundary. Of course, if this is a significant encounter, which usually I assign one or two major engagements during the session, I will have planted into the story and into the non-player character base of the area a pool of clearly defined rumors and effects on community reputation based on the villain to come, so that there is a way for the party to gather information that will add to their experience instead of deduct from it. Now, if we're going to place a monster that is of a random nature, or a one that doesn't seem to be directly linked to the overall story or into the encounter, I need to look into the causes of this encounter, what kind of things might be going on coincidentally nearby, and what the players might be able to derive or conclude from the encounter. When we do this, of course, we also have to take into account what possible benefits or opportunities the players might run into for getting involved with this creature, and ultimately the consequences of both their overt success or their disastrous failure in the face of this encounter. The story, in other words, does not have to depend on the individual encounter, but the individual encounter will have an impact. And so as a dungeon master, you kind of have to have created or established what the results will be if the party fails, and or if they happen to have succeeded. And in certain cases, you could actually have both situations where the creature survived and therefore is after them now, creating a new sub-story and subtext for later messing with them, or can result in perhaps short-circuiting or adjusting your primary storyline. So let's talk about the mechanics actually at this moment, about what it takes to set up an encounter. If you're going to be adding a monster type, something that they have not run into before, there might be an opportunity here to create an anchor into their past by retconning or adjusting their beliefs about that species or that clan of creatures by delving into the pre-character adventuring time frame and anchor it into their past. For example, maybe they had a cousin at some point in the past who was taken prisoner by the kobolds or whatever, and at the same time perhaps you can anchor in or tie into the story tendrils from the future suggesting that this race might become a nuisance or a serious threat at a later time, giving them a reason or justification to want to resolve this particular encounter. In all of this, you want to emphasize the implications of what is occurring. In other words, if the party has been particularly successful in driving off a certain predator race that's been a nuisance, maybe what they've actually done is shifted the focus, and a different enemy now has seen a vacuum and is moving into it. Maybe they need to find out the reasons why this group in particular has moved upon their location, and will want to engage it and take it out to prevent the long-term implications. Ultimately, you have to have for yourself an establishment of the unknowns. What is it about this new villain that's appealing? What reasons would they have of engaging with them? And ultimately, why does that villain fit with where the story is going at this point? Now, in certain cases, this means you have to draw out personality quirks that aren't evident in the character in order to make them desirous of this conclusion, the finishing of this adventure, the taking on of this threat. So you'll want to, in certain cases, do what I call foment informed stupidity. A very good friend of mine, J.M. Albertson, used to say that by its very definition, bravery is informed stupidity. You have to be willing to do something ridiculous to drive back a greater threat, and that requires you to be informed before you make the decision to be stupid. Ultimately, when you're getting ready to start the adventure, you may want to pull back the curtain a bit and let the players have a bit of an insight into the way you think about creatures and see what their response is, because ultimately if something that is scary and interesting to you is absolutely boring to your players, you'll have to either find ways to make it more creative and therefore imaginative and engaging, or accept the fact that that creature type just doesn't engage them like you would want, and therefore consider shifting or adjusting that creature type. Now, the real question, though, is that once the players are aware of this coming encounter, how are you going to ensure that you're scaled to them appropriately? Well, the first thing is to consider how the players are coming to the situation. You want to look at the fact that by giving them a villain and a known location, you fundamentally can cause the players to become the planners, and that you can actually sit and react to them instead of being always the primary driver for the story. Even the story as character can itself become mundane and routine. So in the case of a random encounter, you can actually afford them the opportunity to build the story about how they encounter the monster. This means that you have to take into account what the players determine to be elements of surprise. What are they doing? Are they laying in wait? Are they considering a frontal assault? Are they looking for opportunities to engage the monster out of its domain? All of these can lead to an element of surprise, and the point here is that as a game master, one of the greatest gifts you can give to your players is to be genuinely surprised from time to time with their actions. And this element of surprise can actually throw the players off course a little, because they begin to think that they are in the leadership of the show, so to speak, and so you can do a better job of reading them as you enter the encounter. Now, when it comes to a horrid monster, the best opportunity you have during an encounter to demonstrate how really nasty the villain and the monster is to show the creature's damage dealing potential very early in the encounter, and do the most that you can in the first few rounds to hinder or harm them in terms of the story, taking away perhaps some of their element of surprise or breaking the traps they intended and things like this early on, to show that the monsters are not stupid. They're not going to be pushovers. This is an area where a little bit of finesse can come in. In a recent engagement, an adult red dragon took on the party of adventurers who were not actually intended. It was never my intention for them to actually face it head to head, but as it was, they drew themselves into it, and I, in the first round, eliminated almost 1/3 of them by taking their life points away and putting them in savings from death saves and such. This allows me, of course, to gauge in real time their responses and watch how they react to the damage. I mean, if we are in a situation where the encounter is going to go poorly for them, if I am emphasizing the amount of damage the creature can do, I'm going to cause a shift in their confidence level. And so I have to need to gauge that. And ultimately, you want to find the sweet spot in the encounter. And when I speak of the sweet spot, I'm talking about that moment where the party honestly feels like they might be eliminated, they might not actually succeed, and yet have the tools and the mechanics to actually accomplish their goal. And the best way to do that is for you to keep a running tally of where they are and kind of let their plan unfold. Don't read into it. Don't try to pre-assess it, because quite frankly, if you're playing a monster that's surprised, he's not going to have the ability to react quickly. And so give the party a chance to put their plans into motion so you can see what kind of a time frame they have for success on their own measure, and then you can start to consider the adjustment of the monster's threat appropriately to either drive it to a little bit extended length for your own reasons or for finding ways to either hinder or adjust them if the enemy is already on a course of success that makes it too easy for them to win. Now, this does mean you have to have a pretty good solid grasp on your own assets, your monsters' readiness, response, and reaction to the attacks. You need to assess things like the monster's default. I still use the term THAC0. You need to determine what its tactile breakover point is for dealing damage. If it's relatively high, like a 13 or a 14, maybe you want to find ways to cause the players to suddenly deal with disadvantage to give the monster a chance for a response. Maybe you want to adjust its threshold or determine its resistances and invulnerabilities. If a party, for example, comes into a fight and they're doing, as our group did a few weeks ago, all piercing damage, you can completely devastate their defenses by putting up shields or protections that counteract piercing altogether, or perhaps just reduce the damage from them by giving it some form of resistance. You also need to assess on the fly, in the time frame it takes for them to describe it, the plan they've put together to defeat the monster. Are there any blatant holes in it? For example, I remember an encounter where they didn't take into account that the monster could fly. So they were thinking two-dimensionally. They set up all their attacks to meet the creature on the ground, and all I needed to do to ratchet up the terror of the adventure and make it a much more challenging thing was for the dragon to go airborne. You also need to look for and foment the exploits that the players can take against the monster. For example, creatures that are exceptionally large do have a volatile or vulnerable aft angle. I mean, in other words, if they come up behind the monster, they've got an advantage. They've got the ability to deal with extra damage and so on. Ultimately, you have to look at the player's effectiveness and execution as well. You could have the greatest plan in the world, but if the wizard in the party who's supposed to close the door in the back forgets his role, forgets his duties, perhaps it's going to do them poorly and punish them horribly for that oversight. So it's a matter of assessing their actions versus their intent to make sure that they're following through on the plan as they established it. Now, this also means that in that time frame that it took for the players to start to react to their own results, the monster can certainly develop its own counter strategy. Perhaps it's not going to drive itself away at all. Maybe it's just going to cause the fires to begin now and therefore obviate the need to take care of those disadvantages the players are setting for them. Now, this also means we need to look at the monster's intent and resolve. I mean, if you've got a wandering monster, something that's truly just minding its own business, going from point A to point B, and the party engages, there's just as much likelihood that that monster is going to intentionally disengage and withdraw as it is to stand there and fight toe-to-toe, and that's all dependent upon what you intend for the monster's purposes in being there. You wouldn't necessarily write an adventure if you expected them to ignore it, but perhaps, on the other hand, maybe you didn't expect them to attack it, but rather to talk to it. Maybe it becomes very chatty Cathy in order to try to reduce and mitigate the damage that it's taking. Ultimately, you need to figure out whether the monster has in its own strategy at this point developed an escape plan or conversely a success plan, either fainting for or fighting for its existence and trying to figure out an escape plan, or whether it's already calculated the number of rounds it can take the damage and is planning on obliterating the party. Ultimately, in all of these things, you have to act with authority and the appropriate ferocity for the creature. I mean, if a troll wizard is about to withdraw, he certainly wouldn't be using hyper-aggressive spells to drive the players to a higher level of ire. Instead, he's going to try to spells and effects that are going to draw down the player's ardor and to bring the engagement to a tiny and safer result. Now, going mechanically to the very fight itself, we have to look at and recognize and thereby and by that reward sound planning. In other words, if they have taken great pains to put the fighters in all the right spots to be able to get off an ambush, although if you did it every time, it would be boring. Sometimes it's the best pattern to just simply let the ambush work and watch the players surprise when the damage that they deal, the successes they have, are far and away lower than intended. Now, you also want to exhibit originality in the monster in its attempts to escape. I mean, if you corner a dragon, maybe it'll fight, maybe it'll take off flying, maybe it'll simply beat its wings and drive you back with the buffeting winds. There's a lot of different ways that a monster can attempt to extricate itself from the dangerous situation. Maybe it's spellcasting, who knows? But the point is that for the players to get the full benefit of the creature, give it every opportunity to make good its escape and its withdrawal from the engagement, because not all monsters want to turn and fight toe-to-toe. Not all monsters ultimately don't care if they die. There's quite a few of them, actually, that will even fall to parley rather than face elimination. Ultimately, this means that your monster has to be able to gauge, you as the monster should be able to gauge your role in the story and make sure that you become the show, but you don't steal the show. You don't take it to a level that the players cannot engage with or won't want to be a part of. Of course, on the other hand, if the party's planning was ineffective or didn't take into account obvious benefits of your creature, there's absolutely nothing wrong with punishing poor planning or even punishing failed execution steps. Now, really, the key to a good encounter is to make the most of the randomness of the fights. Deploy your best attempts to escape at the point where the players have made their first and arguably their most damaging mistakes. Ultimately, of course, you want to play to the audience. So early on, you'll be able to tell whether the collective consciousness is leaning towards complete annihilation of your monster and the overall almost gratuitous success, or whether they are truly terrified for their lives and afraid that they won't survive. Either which way, you definitely want to play to that audience and give the players kind of what they're looking for, the release that a great fight against an evil villain can warrant. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual process of the challenge rating itself. When putting together the adventure, the monster manual has an extensive list of all the different monsters and their planned CR ratings. And until you have a real comfort zone with that, I'd kind of play to that level using the basic premise that a six-member party of third-level characters is basically a total CR rating of 18 for the whole encounter. That means from the NPCs they talk to in the first part and the random encounters they have on the way, the ultimate big baddie can't equal much more than 2/3 of that number, all depending on how, of course, you set up the fight scenes and such. But you want to construct this so that the very process of battle prep is realizing what the monsters themselves can do and what resources they have at hand, and utilizing those potentials and propensities to get the players into those compromising positions that make them so appreciative of the success of their mission. This, of course, means you need to know the cast. You need to have a clear understanding of what the players have as far as weaponry, as far as defensive capabilities, and what other kinds of mischief they can create. Now, that also means you need to know the tools of your trade, which means not only to know which monsters you have in the encounter, but that you also have a clear understanding of what resistances and vulnerabilities and weaknesses each of them has, so that you're not caught flat-footed by your players. Ultimately, this means that you need to not only have all of these tools, but that you should know and use all your resources. Don't hold back simply to keep the party members alive, but rather push the adventure and engage your successes compared to their own effectiveness. Now, this comes to what I call managing the sliding scales. If a monster has been running rolling dice poorly and not achieving its objectives, perhaps you'll merge attacks and give them some kind of modifiers to make it so they can deal damage and make the threat more real. Ultimately, you have to manage the monster's attack rating and their speed and number of attacks and all of that. Engage that with the total number of bodies the players have to expend, so that you don't ever leave them at the boy, I lost my train of thought right there. I'll get back on it here in a second. But by managing these sliding scales of attack versus armor, damage dealt to the players versus damage they're dealing, you also have to look at the monsters from the standpoint of their effectiveness in terms of survival instinct. Creatures that have lived for a long time don't tend to want to give up the ghost in a single fight. They're much more willing to withdraw and recuse themselves from the battlefield and give the players a win rather than end up dead. Of course, this ultimately leads to better villains, because your better villains live from battle to battle and become more of a threat over time. And ultimately, with the monsters, you have to have an established PTL moment. And PTL moment, I mean the playtest moment, that place where you start playing to lose instead of playing to win. And I'm sure I'll get some feedback, pushback from some of you as game masters who think that the role is to be more of a judge, jury, and executioner than an actual story agent. But choosing a point at which the monsters start to intentionally withdraw, start to second guess themselves, and start to reduce their own effectiveness. This is important because story elements require the players to make it from episode to episode, and if you're doing far too efficiently with your monsters, there simply won't be any players left at the end of the engagement. So make sure you know when to play to lose, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that within the series when we're doing the actual course classes. But this has given you an idea of how to handle a bit of the balancing. You simply watch the rate of speed of the monsters, ability to deal damage, engage that with the player's resiliency to the damage, and vice versa. Track how much damage the players are dealing to the monsters, and perhaps manage that against the player's own wounds. Well, this is we've run through my materials. I don't see anybody on board the class. I ostensibly was going to start having an FAQ section at the end so people could ask questions. So in the future, do try to join me for the live sessions so that we can go over those questions you might have and can get you the information you need to be the better storyteller and game master that you hope to be. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru for Just in Time Productions Game Mastery Series. You have a good day.